And then we have the English colonies that are the middle and southern colonies. The thing is, leading up to the English Civil War, there's this huge burst of colonization that ends in about 1640. And then we have the English Civil War, and then in 1660, Charles II is back on the throne, and he basically wants to support, not just support his supporters, but like thank his supporters who had, been loyal to him during his absence. And how does he do this? He gives them a lot of land in the Americas. This is when we see the colonies of like Carolina, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York all be set up, and they are all proprietary colonies. For instance, Carolina. In 1663, a group of individuals who had been supportive of Charles II were given the land all the way from southern Virginia down to northern Florida. Keep in mind, Florida is still owned by the Spanish at this time. Now, this group of men envisioned they really wanted to set up this, prosperous, orderly society that included things like property ownership, but also political rights and some sort of hierarchical social order. They had a plan to have colonial aristocrats. They wanted, a large class of freeholders. They wanted them to be able to own farms, elect representatives, and then, of course, you have slaves at the bottom of society. This doesn't really quite go into effect. The thing is, people start moving in to this region from Virginia and the West Indies and basically settle where they wanted, would go on to antagonize the local Native Americans, and even voted to reject the fundamental constitutions. In the Carolinas, we're going to see a lot of these people that move in are going to start raising livestock, in particular for the West Indies, and then their big staple commodity starting about the 1690s is rice. We're going to see, unfortunately and ironically, they learned how to farm rice generally from African slaves. And then the sad thing is, because of this, it's a very intensive crop that needs a lot of care. It led to the profits from rice cultivation being put back into more African slaves. In fact, by 1708 in the Carolinas, there are more black slaves than white settlers. Later, they would outnumber white people 2-1. The thing is, rice is really a substantial investment in land and labor and equipment. If you've ever seen a rice field, you have to have like dikes and dams. You have to basically flood your fields and everything. And this is all really expensive. And so it ends up pushing out a lot of the poorer settlers who would move further north into what becomes North Carolina, where the land and climate is not as suitable for rice. And instead here they might raise tobacco or livestock, or they might make pitch tar and have timber from, like pine forest, things like that. And so this is going to eventually lead that these economies are enough different that we're going to see a split of North and South Carolina in 1729. I should make a note really quick. The rice planters here, especially in more so South Carolina than anywhere else, are the richest people on the mainland English colonies. Their country, though, is a lot more black than white. And so this means that they are always in fear that there might be some sort of slave rebellion. And thus they're going to enact really, really harsh slave codes, very similar to that in the West Indies. I should also mention Georgia here. The thing is, Georgia initially is going to be established by James Oglethorpe, and James Oglethorpe actually wanted not to have slavery in Georgia when it was established in 1732. However, the big problem was that a lot of the colonists that moved in saw that rice would be the big thing that turned profit, and the colonists would basically insist that they needed slaves in order to keep up with South Carolina, and James Oglethorpe will reluctantly legalize slavery. In fact, by 1770, so like once we get up to the American Revolution, nearly half of Georgia's population is going to be that of slaves. And so those are really the big southern colonies. But then we have the middle colonies, including Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is going to be a proprietary colony that is owned basically by one William Penn. He, just like the group that had established the Carolinas, had a plan to make Pennsylvania be a utopia of sorts when he established it in 1681. So keep in mind, this is the land north of Maryland. He wanted to set up this to be like a model of justice and peace, and also a refuge for the Quakers, which were a persecuted religious sect that he was from. The thing is, the Quakers had some disturbing social and political implications for that time period. For instance, they did things like they rejected the trained clergy and church rituals. They saw women as their spiritual equals. They would even let like women have like separate meetings and authority over what they dubbed like women's matters. The Quakers refused to remove their hats in the presence of social superiors. They refused military service. They renounced any kind of use of force. So you can see how this is kind of breaking down a lot of the ideas of the hierarchy that's such a big part of Europe. You can imagine how they were a persecuted religious sect at this time. I should also mention, in the initial Pennsylvania colony, the area that came to be Delaware, the Indians that had lived there, their numbers had been really drastically reduced by disease and warfare. Despite this, the English colonists under William Penn were required to get along with each other and the Indians. And in fact, they would pay Indians for their land, regulate trade, and generally they had a very peaceful relationship with Native Americans. In fact, so much so that other Native Americans would actually move to these areas. However, the relationship between William Penn himself and the settlers was not as good. While he allowed for things like religious freedom, he really designed his political structure, his legislature, with very limited powers, and gave himself considerable authority. Basically what happens is the elected members of his assembly are going to object to all of his proprietary privileges, such as things like he controlled all foreign trade and the collection of fees from landholders, and eventually a group of them in the lower Delaware River would gain autonomy and create the unofficial colony that is later come to be Delaware. Quick note about these middle colonies, though. Generally, they were more like scattered farms rather than towns. There was some very rich farmland along the coast. It really became a thriving economy, though some might argue that the religious experiment may have failed. And this is when we jump back to the Dutch colonies that are now going to become English colonies. I'm not going into all the details here, but basically, when we look at New Netherland, its site was within the borders of the original charter of the Virginia colony. And so English settlers that made up part of New Netherland are going to rebel, and the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, is actually going to end up surrendering without a shot fired. And so basically, virtually overnight in 1664, New Netherland became New York, and thus an American colony. Or not American colony, I should say, a English colony. Once again, just wanted you to look at this map so you can see now how we've done. We did the Chesapeake colonies first, Virginia and Maryland, that's that green. Then we jumped up to the New England colonies, and then just now we've looked at those lower south colonies, or really I just call them the southern colonies at this point, and then the middle colonies.